Hi everyone, hope we're doing well. For today's video, I want to talk about everything you need to know in order to filet crochet. So before I get into the two main techniques that we like to use in order to filet crochet, first let's just talk a little bit about filet crochet in general and what you're going to need to know and have in order to do it. So the short explanation as to what filet crochet is filet crochet is basically just a mesh stitch where part of the panel is opaque, and the contrast between the opaqueness and the sheerness creates a design or an image. Now you should be able to do this technique as a beginner because it only involves double crochets and chain stitches. So if you're a confident beginner, as long as you know those two stitches, you should be fine to learn how to filet crochet. However, if you're struggling with picking up how to filet crochet, I would suggest that you learn how to do a basic mesh stitch first. So what materials are you going to need in order to filet crochet? A lot of filet crochet that you will have seen uses something called mercerized cotton. However, I have filet crocheted with different materials. So as a beginner, I would probably stick to either double knit yarn or 4-ply yarn. And then as for the hook size you're going to want to use, I would suggest that you use a hook size which is a lot smaller than the one that your yarn recommends. So the yarn that I'm using today is Yeoman Yarn's mercerized cotton, which suggests that you use a 3.25mm hook, but I'm going to be using a 1.75mm hook. And we do this because using a smaller hook size is going to create tighter stitches, so the opaque parts of your panel are going to be even more opaque. But then obviously the mesh stitch is still going to be sheer because it's a mesh stitch, so you're creating more contrast, which will create a clearer image. Now on top of some yarn and a hook, you're also going to want to pick a graph that you want to follow. Obviously I will provide the graph that I'm following in this video in the link below. However, you can pick any graph that you would like to pick. I personally would just suggest that you pick a graph that's no bigger than 20 by 20 boxes. Now we've gathered everything that we need and we're ready to start filet crocheting. Our first step before we actually pick up our hook and our yarn is we need to figure out how many chains we need in order to create the pixel grid that we've picked. How you're going to do this is you're going to count the amount of boxes in the width of the graph, which for me is going to be 17. Then you're going to times this number by 2, so for me that's 34, and then add 4. So I'll quickly explain how this works. One of these boxes is created by 2 stitches, which is going to be a double crochet and a chain 1. So each one of these boxes has 2 stitches, so I'm going to get the total amount of boxes that we have and times it by 2. But if we imagine this, that means that our final stitch in our row would be a chain, and that's not going to create a box. We need to actually add another stitch in order to kind of close off this final box. So in my case, to finish off that 17th box, I need to actually add a 35th chain in order to create that double crochet, which will enclose that box. And then the extra 3 chains that I'm adding on top of this extra 1 is just our turning chain, because our turning chain counts as our first double crochet chain 1. Obviously, if you're a beginner, you do not need to worry about this at all. I would just get the amount of boxes that you have in your width, times it by 2, and then add 4. That's going to be how many chains you need. So I've done those 38 chains. To start our first row of filet crochet, what we're going to do is we're going to skip a total of 5 chain stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to work into this 6th stitch right here. If you prefer, you can work into the back loop here, but personally I like to go into the back bump of my stitch, but this is just personal preference. So we're going to start by entering a double crochet. And what this will do is create that first box that we need. All we're going to be doing is we're going to chain 1 stitch, and then we're going to skip the next available stitch in the row below and go into the 2nd stitch from the last stitch that we've gone into with a double crochet. So I'm going to yarn over, insert my hook, before then doing a double crochet. Like that. So I'm going to do the same thing again where I chain 1 stitch, skip the next available stitch in the row below and enter a double crochet into the 2nd stitch from the last stitch that we went into. And we're just going to repeat that pattern all the way up until we reach the first chain that we made right at the start of our row. So I'm just going to do my final double crochet. Each one of these boxes is kind of representing one of the boxes in our pixel grid. So at this point, I would just go ahead and double check that you're happy with the amount of boxes that you've created. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So I've created 17 holes like this. And this matches my pixel grid because the pixel grid that I'm using has a width of 17 boxes. So now we've built our first row, we're ready to work on our second row where we encounter our coloured squares. So to start our next row, we're going to do a turning chain of 3. Before we then turn our work, skip this chain here and work a double crochet on top of this double crochet like this. And this is going to create that first mesh box, which you can see here. Following the graph, I've got a total of 2 more that I need to make. So you can see here I've created these 3 holes which are going to emulate those 3 empty uncoloured boxes. We now have 3 coloured boxes in a row. So what we're going to do, instead of a double crochet and a chain like we normally would, we're just going to be doing 2 double crochets. So technically this is my first double crochet, and normally we'd do double crochet chain 1, but we're going to do 2 double crochets instead and work that into our chain stitch. So we're going to put a double crochet in like that, and that represents us doing 1 of our boxes. And if you remember earlier, we have a total of 3. So I'm just going to continue doing those 2 double crochets together, and I need to carry this on up until I take the space of 3 mesh boxes. And that has gone through the 3 mesh boxes, which if you compare, we have these 3 mesh boxes below our double crochets. So this is going to be an easier way for you to identify how many stitches you've done. But now we're back to that mesh stitch. So I've done my double crochet on top of my double crochet. In filet crochet, there should never be a point where these double crochets in your mesh stitch should be replaced by chains. Instead, the easier way to think about it is these chains might turn into double crochets, but they will always turn back into chains. But these double crochets in the mesh stitch will always stay there. I'm gonna chain 1, skip 1, double crochet, and I'm going to continue this up until I've done those 5 mesh boxes like the pattern is telling me to do so. So again, I've created those 5 mesh boxes, so now I'm going back to the pattern of doing 2 double crochets together rather than double crochet chain 1, and I'm going to be doing that for a total of 3 mesh boxes. If you're confused as to how many double crochets you should be doing when you have a row of a few boxes, what you want to do is get the number of boxes you need to go across, times it by 2, and add 1. So using this as an example, the double crochets are to represent a total of 3 boxes. And if we get 3 boxes and times it by 2, that's 6 total, add 1, that's 7. And if we look here, we have a total of 7 double crochets that are together. So now I know that I'm ready to start adding my mesh boxes, and these 7 double crochets are all together, and there's a chain on this side, so there needs to be a chain on this side, or else we just wouldn't have 7 double crochets. So as you can see, I have these 3 mesh boxes left, which kind of corresponds with what the pattern's telling me to do, so I know that I'm on the right track. And when it comes to working into this first mesh box, or from this point on, anytime you crochet into the turning chain, you're still going to follow the pattern of skipping the next available stitch or chain, and then working your double crochet into the next available stitch. So now it's kind of just a case of repeating what we've just done. So each row is going to start by a chain of 3, turning our work, and creating our first mesh box by doing our double crochet here. Now, if you look at the pattern, I need a total of 2 mesh boxes before I change my pattern. So I'm going to add in another mesh box by chaining 1 and doing a double crochet. And obviously the pattern tells me that I now need to do a total of 5 mesh boxes along, which in total, if you remember the formula from earlier, 2 times 5 equals 10, plus 1 equals 11. So including this first double crochet, I should be doing 11 double crochets before I change my stitch back to a chain. I also use the stitches underneath to kind of guide where those stitches are going. So if we look at the pattern, this row has an extra coloured box either side of the 3 here, and I can see within my pattern that that's gonna take up this mesh box here and this mesh box here. So I could count those 11, or I could literally just look at this point and be like, okay, all of this is going to be double crochets. So I use a mix of both of those approaches to decide what stitch I'm doing where. I feel like everyone will have a slightly different way of approaching it. So kind of the long story short is you're either going to be doing double crochet chain 1 or 2 double crochets together. So hopefully we get the basics of this stitch. I'm now going to finish this panel off camera to show you guys what this method will look like. So I'm ready to do my final stitch and finish everything off. So I'm gonna cut my yarn and then yarn over and pull that through the loop that's on my hook. This panel still needs blocking, but this is going to be what our filet crochet looks like with a double crochet chain 1 filet crochet. So hopefully by now you guys kind of get the general concept around filet crochet. The one thing I do want to mention here is if you're following a grid that isn't symmetrical, you want to make sure that every time you read a new row, you're reading in the opposite direction. At this point, I'm ready to share the second technique that we like to use in filet crochet, which is a tiny bit harder maths wise to kind of work out, but the principles are exactly the same. The first thing you need to know is that your starting chain formula is going to be a little bit different. You're going to get the amount of boxes in the width of your graph, and this time we're going to times it by 3, and then we want to add 5 stitches. So in this case, 17 times by 3 is 51, and then add 5 is 56. So that's going to be how many chains I need to start off with. Now I've skipped a total of 7 stitches this time and worked my first double crochet into the 8th stitch away from my hook. And now I'm going to chain 2, and then I'm going to skip 2 chains, so these 2 here, and into this 3rd chain. That's where I'm going to be doing my double crochet. And then we're going to continue this pattern to build up our first row of mesh boxes. To start our next row, we're going to chain a total of 4, not 3. And now our mesh boxes represent a double crochet, a chain 2 and a skip 2. The coloured boxes are going to consist of 3 double crochets. So just like before, if you want to work out how many double crochets you need to do in a row, you want to get the amount of boxes that are together, times it by 3, and then add 1. And if we get 3 and times it by 3 and then add 1, we're going to have a total of 10. And if we look here, that is a total of 10 double crochets. So now I know that I'm ready to chain 2 and do a double crochet to create our next mesh box. And you're going to continue everything else like we did before. So those are the 2 main filet crochet techniques that we like to use within crochet, but at this point you might be asking me which one you should use when. And whilst there's not really kind of a correct answer, I will give you which techniques is better for what. If you have a huge project, the double crochet chain 1 technique is going to save you time because obviously you're reducing your stitch count by 1/3. Or I suppose if we're going mathematically, it's probably not exactly 1/3. However, the double crochet chain 2 method is going to be a lot clearer for images that don't contain as many boxes kind of close together. So if you have any kind of really intricate detail, or specifically just kind of like lines that only consist of a width or a height of 1 or 2 boxes, you're probably better off using a double crochet chain 2 technique, just because then you're less likely to run into the problem of your image not being clear enough for your project. Now I say all of this, I really don't have a preference one way or another. Even at this point in my crochet journey, I still reach for both techniques, so they definitely both have their ups and downs. Sometimes it's just going to be a personal preference thing, but I definitely think that knowing how to do both of these techniques is the most beneficial. And then finally, before I say goodbye to you, I just want to show you how to guesstimate how big your filet crochet project is going to be. So first, you're going to crochet a swatch of 5 mesh boxes by 5 mesh boxes boxes. I'm going to insert the pattern that I use for this in the description box below. You want to measure the total width and the total height of your panel. If your filet crochet graph has a lot of coloured boxes, I might consider doing a test swatch that include more double crochets rather than just doing a mesh stitch, but that's kind of up to your own judgment, to be honest. You then want to get your height and your width of your panel and divide it by 5, and then get the width and height of the amount of boxes in your graph and times it by the answer for both of these sums. And that should give you an approximate size as to how big your piece is going to be once you've finished it. Right, that's going to be it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. I do have other videos on filet crochet as well as other crochet techniques, so definitely go ahead and check them out. I also do have a few filet crochet patterns on my Etsy and Ravelry. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and like this video and comment any suggestions or questions that you have. Right, you guys have a good rest of your day and I will see you in the next video. Bye.